This is the opening session of the conference, and we are joined for just this segment by the media, so welcome to the media as well. But it's just for this particular segment. I thought that should be mentioned. And also, as you can see in the program, the conference itself, of course, is organized in the context of the 70th anniversary of NATO and the 20-year existence of the CSDP, the Common Security and Defense Policy of the EU. And before I hand over to our distinguished panelists, perhaps one word on the thinking behind this event. It's always very useful to have that in the back of the mind. The objective really is to examine the main achievements of the cooperation between the EU and NATO, as well as the future of this strategic partnership. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss not just the opportunities and challenges ahead, but also to identify ways to enhance cooperation between the two organizations, and their contributions to European and international security. So with this in mind, it is my pleasure again to introduce our panel, and you will see in the program that we're joined by His Excellency Teodor Meleșcanu, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We have Ambassador Jean-Christophe Belliard, the Deputy Secretary General for Political Affairs of the European External Action Service. We have Mr. James Zapatourai, the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy at NATO. And he is also NATO Secretary General's Special Representative for the Caucasus and Central Asia. And we also have Ambassador Jorge Domecq, the Chief Executive of the European Defense Agency. They will be providing statements. We have just a brief moment for this welcome introductory session. And with this, I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to the Foreign Minister, please.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to have you all here. Let me tell you that I am very happy to see you all at this important event organized by our presidency, the Romanian presidency of the European Union. From this point of view, I would like to say that it is not by chance that security is one of the important issues, the main issues for our presidency. I do not hide the fact that among the priorities of the Romanian presidency, the first one was a priority about cohesion, and the second one, it was about security. That's why I think it's an excellent occasion to discuss honestly and openly about these issues with which we are confronted in Europe and over the oceans. Now, first of all, let me, before starting to say a few words to open the discussions, I would like to welcome you in this very nice room, which is called the Diplomatic Salon. Practically, this was the headquarters of all the diplomats during the First World War. They were meeting here, exchanging informations, ideas, proposals, and finally we decided to give this title of Diplomatic Salon, Diplomatic Room, Diplomatic Hall, and I'm very glad that during the refurbishment of the hotel, we managed to keep it as it was. Thank you very much, and enjoy the stay in Bucharest. Now, when we are speaking about security and defense, it's a top topic for our countries. We are now approaching a very important moment in Europe, which is characterized by the elections for the European Parliament. And I am assured that one of the top issues will be the issue of security during the campaign. I want to tell you that from our point of view, when we speak about security, we are looking at the internal security, but also at external security for our countries. And when we speak about external security, we have two special chapters. One is defending ourselves against the attempts to affect our security, but which is under the Article 5 of NATO. I'm speaking about migration and other issues, interference, hybrid activities. And secondly, really, we are speaking about security in terms of defense, following the provisions of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Now, I had the privilege of attending a few days ago the 70th anniversary of the creation of NATO. I was really very impressed by the very strong signals which were delivered during this meeting. First of all, from my point of view, it was an excellent example to see how do you look at the bipartisan politics in United States. When I had the privilege of attending the speech of Jens Stoltenberg in front of the House of Representatives, chaired by both presidents, Madame Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Pence, it was a very clear and strong message about the bipartisan approach of the United States, one of the pillars of NATO. And from our point of view, it was a very good example. I hope we will try to follow it in our internal politics. But at the same time, I would like to underline the fact that I don't want to enter too much into the specific issues, but I'd like to say a few words about how Romania was evolving in this field of peace and security. Let me tell you that I had the privilege in January 1994 to represent Romania, the first country which signed the Partnership for Peace. And this opening of a policy which was extremely organized, well organized in order to prepare countries from Central European region and the Eastern European region in preparing their participation in NATO. It's really a very important moment, and I'm very happy that we managed to use and to develop this instrument. But secondly, in parallel, I want to underline the fact that in parallel with our desire, I'm speaking about Romania now, to join NATO, starting from 1994, as I said, we also were interested and pushing very solidly for our candidature to the European Union. And practically our national development was in parallel both for NATO and for the European Union accession. And from the very beginning, we were, even before we were members of the European Union, Romania involved already itself in the European security and defense policies, and this is a very clear example of the parallel and common approach we have in this region about peace and security. Okay, by December 99, Romania received the invitation to start formal negotiations for the European Union membership. And on the NATO side, 23 years ago, Romania is the first post-communist country, as I said, who signed the Partnership for Peace. This shows that in the Romanian political DNA, to be a strong advocate from the very beginning, we were a very strong advocate of the idea of EU-NATO partnership, and we remained a very staunch supporter of the transatlantic relationship. This explains why this topic, which is actually at this moment a very central topic, priority of our presidency, permitted us and encouraged us to organize this meeting. It's a key issue about the relationship between NATO and the European Union, and at the same time, I have to recognize that it is also an excellent occasion to speak and to reinforce the ideas concerning the transatlantic relationship, one of the pillars of our security in Europe. From this point of view, I think there were two interesting developments. First of all, in the framework of NATO, this organization was capable to adapt to the changes which took place in Europe. It's really a miracle, because sometimes NATO is considered to be one of the longest and most successful alliances in the world. Even if you look at it like a kind of prehistoric instrument of our security and policy, we realize that the capacity of adapting of NATO and transforming it, being capable to answer and to confront the security priorities, it's a very clear proof and demonstration of the capacity of NATO to adapt and to continue to promote security. In the other side, on the European Union, there were a lot of developments. We have to recognize it. We have the global strategy for the European Union security policy. And since 2016, we have a global and, I will say, robust progress, which has achieved by the European Union policy of security. Adapting, both organizations tried to do their best in order to jointly promote this idea. And this process, I want to underline this fact, has been possible due to the progress and the personal commitment and leadership of both NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and the European Union High Representative Federica Mogherini. Now, in pursuing our preoccupations both in NATO and in the European Union, I wanted to underline that we are speaking about cooperation, which is essential based on principles like inclusivity, flexibility, and geographical balance. One of the important developments at the level of the European Union is the permanent structured cooperation, called sometimes PESCO, which is one of the answers to the false dilemma between efficiency and inclusiveness. It has the potential to make a real difference if we ensure that cooperation projects target the real capabilities gaps existing at European level. I do not want to give the impression that we had some problems in our relations between NATO and the European Union, but one of the most important elements was the decision adopted 15 years ago, since the conclusion of the Berlin Agreement and the famous follow-up known as Berlin Plus. European Union-NATO partnership is constantly developing between our two organizations. Besides the operational aspects, it is worth highlighting the political momentum which made possible this development of our security in Europe. Now, maybe one of the peaks of this cooperation between European Union and NATO was in Warsaw in 2016 at the summit of Warsaw, which created a legacy which must be preserved. And maybe we, the member states, should think how to further build and develop it in the future. I recall the fact that on a lot of important issues in our region, like the Western Balkans, there was always a strategic convergence between the activity of NATO and of the European Union. Even if everyone continued to keep their independence, they cooperated. I'm speaking about, as I said, about the Western Balkans, and we have very precious lessons to learn in terms of strategic coordination, developing interoperability from those historic moments to which we attended as countries and as important actors. Now, I cannot conclude these very short introductory remarks. I would like to underline the very important issue for us, which should be part of our discussions today. I'm speaking about the obligation for all of us to enhance the transatlantic relationship. The transatlantic relationship remains essential for the European security and prosperity. Our common priority should be to build a stronger political consensus among the European and United States leaders on the security problems which we need to solve together. Concurrently, the operations must be reflected at all levels in practical terms of concrete activities. To close this, I will simply say that we cannot imagine peace and security without this transatlantic relationship, and from our point of view, this is one of the key elements of our progress in assuring security and defense for our countries and in the world at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Meleșcanu, for setting the stage for the conversations today. Very much appreciated. And I also now would take the opportunity to extend the floor to Mr. Jean-Christophe Belliard from the External Action Service.
Je peux parler en français? Non, Monsieur le Ministre, juste d'abord vous remercier d'être ici aujourd'hui. La Roumanie qui préside l'Union européenne, la Roumanie membre de l'OTAN, la Roumanie pays riverain de la mer Noire, dans un moment où un certain nombre de choses se sont récemment passées, la question de la liberté de navigation, le détroit de Kerch, la mer d'Azov. Je crois que cette réunion aujourd'hui ici est pertinente. Let me, sorry, I apologize to speak English. Nobody is perfect. Let me say a couple of words on the EU security and defense, where we stand today in Brussels. With the EU, what are we today? We are the first investor in the world, the first exporter, the first importer, the first provider of development aid, the first provider of humanitarian aid. And for all these reasons, the EU has expressed, and this is something new, its ambition to take more responsibility for its own security and the security of its citizens. Europe will also increase its share of the transatlantic burden by developing its capabilities, and improve its contribution to international peace and security. As you have noticed over the past years, there has been a switch, something has changed. The EU has taken a new initiative. You mentioned, Mr. Minister, the permanent structure cooperation. We can also mention the establishment of the new Permanent Military Command Center, MPCC. All this was unthinkable some years ago in Brussels. The new political ambition is met by an unexpected important mobilization of financial resources, and this is what matters. In total, close to 30 billion euros for defense-related programs for the period 2021-2027, 13 billion for the European Defence Fund, 6.5 billion for military mobility, and 10.5 billion for the European Peace Facility. This investment in European defense will not replace member states' defense spending, but is designed to act as a flywheel for closer cooperation aimed at reducing fragmentation. So my message today is that what the EU is doing to develop a more capable European Union is also good for NATO. While a strong NATO is, of course, in the interest of the EU, a more capable EU will be able to take more responsibility and a greater share of the common burden. This will also be to the benefit of NATO, as member states own the capabilities and can make them available in the NATO context. A close and mutually reinforcing EU-NATO partnership and transatlantic bond remains essential to tackle common security threats and challenges. The new EU defense instruments should generate more, better coordinated and more collaborative defense investment by member states. They aim to encourage and incentivize collaboration among EU member states. And a more capable European Union should be able to take more responsibility and share a bigger part of the burden. By the same token, it should also strengthen the European contribution within the alliance. The EU fully recognizes NATO's role in the collective defense of its allies. This is enshrined in our treaties, in our European treaties. We should avoid debates about respective competencies, as they are very clear, but rather focus on positive ways of mutual reinforcement, military mobility, hybrid threats, and exercises. In the current strategic context, EU and NATO standing together remain key. Our reinforced cooperation sends a powerful political message regarding the strengths of the transatlantic bond. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Belliard, also for the message. A more capable Europe means a more responsible Europe, and it's also for the benefit of the relationship with NATO. With this, now we turn over to Mr. Apaturai. Very much look forward to your intervention from a NATO perspective.
Thank you. The other side of Brussels, the less nice part near the airport. So first of all, thank you very much to the government, to my colleagues from Brussels who are here for the invitation to be here. It's a real honor. And let me say the Romanian representation in NATO is so active on the issues which are important to Romania that I can only look forward to a very successful presidency, because really this is a very, very energized diplomatic representation for us. I remember when I started at NATO, because I've been there a very long time. I think you used the word prehistoric about NATO, but I feel prehistoric too. And I came to Brussels and started playing ice hockey, because I'm Canadian, with Swedes and Finns, and some of them worked at the EU, so I decided to go and have lunch with a friend who worked at the EU, but not to talk about EU business, just to have lunch. And I was told when I came back that someone had seen me having lunch with an EU official in public, and this was unacceptable, and I shouldn't do it. So this was the climate 20 years ago. We had much better relations with Russia. We had a NATO-Russia Council. We had cooperative projects. We did things all over. But the EU was untouchable for all sorts of happily largely gone political reasons. So really things have changed very fundamentally, and I think it's always worthwhile looking back to see how far we've come. And we now have, I think through the joint declarations and the 74 areas of cooperation that have been agreed between the two organizations, not just an unprecedented level of cooperation, both in the depth and the breadth, but also what I think is really good is that we have an irreversible agreement for cooperation. And that is a very, very fundamental step forward. And what I think really sparked it was the deterioration in the security environment, both terrorism but also the instability that Russia is introducing into the European environment. And both organizations and their members realized that we could no longer avoid in this environment the realization that neither the EU nor NATO alone are sufficient to provide security for all of our respective member states. And that's not going to change. Both organizations have civilian and military components, but of course NATO is much more capable in the military side, the EU much more capable and better resourced on the civilian side, but we need each other, and we will continue to need each other. So this environment and requirement will not change, and we will continue to do that. So what was then interesting was that we had to establish this cooperation. So I decided to draft what was called what I called a playbook. A playbook, I discovered Europeans don't use that term, but it's an American football term which says on every page, what defense do you see and what offense do you run? If you see this, what do you do? So I thought this would be a useful thing for us to have. What I realized then was we didn't even have personal contacts between the people who worked on one issue on one side in NATO and the other side in the EU. So we had to start from the very beginning. Phone numbers, names, and this was just a few years ago. But we established that. And what has really, I think, now shaped our cooperation going forward are these declarations, but in particular that we have a full spectrum of threats that we need to face, and a full spectrum of areas in which we need to cooperate. There's a lot of discussion of what we call hybrid defense, and that composes the full spectrum of threats that our countries face, from cyber attacks to information attacks to energy cutoffs to little green men to big green tanks. Sometimes we talk about hybrid stopping at the little green men. It doesn't. If you ask the Ukrainians, it goes all the way, which is why we need to work together. We need to work together on maritime cooperation, on developing defense capabilities, on exercises, on capacity building for partners. We are doing all of those things. And so I think we're going in a good direction. We've already discussed, and then I'll close, the second aspect of this, which is the strengthening of European defense and EU defense capabilities. And NATO supports these. And we support them for two reasons, and they've already been mentioned. One is that it makes Europe stronger, and in making European countries stronger, those capabilities can also be made available for NATO. So to the extent that it stimulates capability development, we strongly support that. The second reason is because it contributes to transatlantic burden sharing. It is clear, I think, to everyone that the United States wants to see European allies contribute, or European countries and Europe contribute more to its own defense, its own security, and to international security. And a stronger EU helps make that possible. So for both of these reasons, we really support it. It is also the case, of course, that as it develops, it has to develop in the right way. So without unnecessary duplication, and very much taking account of non-EU allies and their desire to contribute to this overall security effort. And we discuss that on a regular basis, and I'm quite sure we'll find good solutions. So overall, we're quite encouraged by the last 3 years. We have made more progress in the last 4 years than we made in the last 30. And that, I think, should give everybody cause for hope.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I think the first time we met was some 16, 17 years ago. You were already at NATO. I was already with the EU. And I think we did okay. Perhaps one of the reasons was that we met outside of Brussels. This was in Rome, so there were no repercussions. But thank you for underlining really the complementarity of the two organizations, and also how much has been done over the last couple of years. It's also a story that you hear within the EU, and for that reason it is very important to highlight the speed of this development in very recent years, and the fact that now there is a playbook, there is this kind of forward-looking guidance. Now with this, I turn over to Jorge Domecq, Chief Executive of the EDA, to hear a bit more, because you are very active actually in making sure that this this playbook actually takes place, very engaged with NATO and many different projects. So look forward to your intervention. Please, Jorge.
Thank you, Gustav, and thank you, Minister, also for inviting me to be here today, celebrating not only the 70 years of NATO, the 20 years of the European Common Security and Defense Policy, but also the 15th year of the European Defense Agency, which will happen this summer. So, to sum up to many of the issues that have been raised, and looking backwards only 2.5 years ago, all EU members and NATO agreed on a common set of proposals to implement the 2016 Warsaw Joint Declaration. And now, 4 months into 2019, we have already reached what many of you have underlined as unprecedented level of EU-NATO cooperation. And knowing both sides of town, I personally value this achievement and believe it is important to continue also in the future. For the European Defense Agency, informal output-oriented interactions with NATO are not entirely new and go back to even before the joint declaration. However, what we have achieved with the joint declaration is a more streamlined manner of engagement. In the excellent cooperation with the Commission and the External Action Service, the agency works with NATO on 30 of the 74 actions and 6 out of the 7 domains, but has the leading role on one which has been mentioned many times this morning, which is defense capabilities. And a key task in here today and in the future is to ensure what we call in our jargon coherence of output with NATO, and specifically with the Capability Development Plan and CARD and the relevant NATO defense processes. It is important that through this interaction we ensure that the revised EU priorities are fully coherent with NATO targets, and that means that they should not be divergent or contradictory. They should complement, and they should make the European capability landscape more coherent and efficient. Now, looking ahead, EDA and NATO staffs will continue to benefit from cross-invitations by individual EU member states and NATO allies to their bilateral discussions and multilateral consultations in the respective EU and NATO processes. And by ensuring transparency and reciprocity, we also avoid increasing the reporting burden on nations that belong to both organizations, as coherence of output is primarily pursued by member states. In the frame of the joint declaration implementation, EDA and NATO staffs further talk on a day-to-day basis to enhance complementarity and avoid what we always are talking about, unnecessary duplication in multinational capability development, including now in the implementation of the CDP through what we call strategic context cases, which will propose concrete lines of action of how to achieve the priorities on the European side. And there are concrete examples of our output-oriented cooperation on defense capability development. Looking at the big picture, on the EU side, the implementation of the EU defense initiatives is now in full swing. The CDP, the CARD, the PESCO represent building blocks of an emerging end-to-end European defense planning framework that aims to deliver concrete defense capabilities to our member states, with the European Defence Fund acting as an important incentive towards defense cooperation. So we can state clearly that we are already moving towards cooperative solutions as a norm. However, let me be clear. These initiatives as I've explained in the past, are not being put in place in order to work towards a European army. These initiatives should lead us over time to a coherent set of usable, deployable, sustainable capabilities and forces. And in this way, a stronger European defense will also strengthen NATO, enabling us to take our fair share of burden. And ultimately, the initiatives should contribute to achieving the EU level of ambition and an appropriate degree of European strategic autonomy. And we should strive to avoid misleading messages on both sides, as we otherwise risk the overall progress in EU-NATO cooperation. Now, looking ahead, the agency, with its defense expertise, will continue to play a key role in its support to member states in ensuring coherence among these EU defense initiatives, as well as with NATO. In the same manner as the capability development plan and the NATO defense planning process are developed and implemented, ensuring no unnecessary duplication, no diverging priorities and complementarity, I should stress that PESCO has not been developed in isolation either, as the member states' notification on PESCO already referred to NATO, and I quote, "A long-term vision of PESCO could be to arrive at a coherent full-spectrum force package in complementarity with NATO, which will continue to be the cornerstone of collective defense for its members." End of quote. Moreover, EDA has the important tasking from the Council to ensure that in the PESCO projects, which should facilitate the fulfillment of the more binding commitments, there is no unnecessary duplication of efforts, including regarding NATO. And so far, we have assessed all PESCO projects against NDPP targets, and 25 out of the 34 also referred to NATO priorities. And we will continue this effort, leveraging our direct supporting role to various PESCO projects. EDA is a platform under ministerial guidance and an integrator of different perspectives in European defense, from capability planning to armaments, from research to defense policy. And the unique nature of the agency is an asset to member states in the EU-NATO cooperation, out of which we should make the most. That is why we talk to NATO bodies and agencies across the board, from the international staff, defense policy and planning, defense investment, emergent security operations, to the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation and the NATO agencies, or STO. Through this comprehensive approach, we can further ensure coherence. And allow me to conclude by highlighting what, in my view, are three particularly important challenges regarding the way ahead in EU-NATO cooperation. First, as defense budgets in Europe are increasing across the board, we have to ensure to also effectively use the resources made available. 2 weeks ago in Washington, the NATO Secretary General commended European efforts to increase defense spending. Indeed, Europe as a whole is already the second largest investor in defense after the United States. And together with Canada, European allies have spent an additional 41 billion euros in the last 2 years only against the 2014 baseline. And this figure will further grow to 100 billion by 2020 and to a total of 350 billion by 2024. The money must now translate into effective output and a more coherent European capability landscape. In other words, and as I said before, a more interoperable, sustainable, usable, and deployable set of capabilities and forces. This increase in defense spending has to develop the capabilities our armed forces need to overcome their shortcomings and also to reduce the fragmentation and inefficiencies of today. The fresh spending also needs to build on research and technological advances, as we think not only about today, but also the capabilities our armed forces will need tomorrow and in the future. And this brings me to the second challenge. Ultimately, as I always advocate, It is not only about spending more, but about spending better and in cooperation, which is exactly what we seek to achieve with the new EU defense initiatives. While we are already moving towards EU defense cooperation, it is a long-term effort. It requires a change of mindset in capitals and buy-in from the ministries of defense at all levels and in the different defense communities, from armaments to policy, from defense planning to research. And it is essential for these new EU defense initiatives to become fully embedded in national defense plans. Coherence also starts in capitals. And last but not least, continued interoperability of EU and NATO remains highly important. We need to ensure that Europe, and in particular the EU, remains a reliable and credible partner. And this is key for the good health of the transatlantic link, which remains essential for the security and stability of Europe. We therefore have to avoid any technological gap between both sides of the Atlantic. A growing technological gap could easily become a serious operational gap, making our forces less interoperable and could lead over time to a political gap. Interoperability requires investment in research and maintaining strong and competitive defense industries on both sides of the Atlantic, underpinning the defense capabilities of our armed force needs. And member states and allies have a single set of forces and capabilities, as well as experts. And the security of EU and NATO is interconnected. We need to continue developing our unprecedented cooperation to take on those challenges, and we have in common. And I would like to end by paraphrasing what Secretary General Stoltenberg stated in the US Congress 2 weeks ago, that to defend each other, to protect each other, and to keep our people safe, we must overcome our differences, even more so today, as we face unprecedented challenges that no nation can take on alone. But I would add, and no organization either. And that is why EU and NATO cooperation is so important, not only for the protection of our territories and our citizens, but more importantly, of our way of life. Thank you.
Ambassador Domecq, thank you also for your intervention. Very clearly, you have provided many examples of how this relationship is happening in practical terms. And you have also highlighted some of the common challenges that we need to ensure that we take on as we move forward. So thank you very much for this.